Here with us to introduce our speaker is Randy Klotz from UNFI.
Thanks, Gigi. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. This is Randy Klotz, Director of Retail Accounting at UNFI. And for those of you who are not as familiar with us, retail accounting is one of the many professional services that UNFI provides to independent grocery retailers to help them with back office and other functions so retailers can focus on customers and the operation of their business. And one of the program offerings is HR compliance. And retail accounting partners with My HR Concierge to provide HR compliance services to independent grocery retailers. Today's webinar is co-sponsored by both My HR Concierge and UNFI, and will provide you with guidance on HR fundamentals that every independent grocer should know. And today I'm super excited to have Chris Cooley, principal and co-founder of My HR Concierge, with us. Chris will present on several relevant topics. And if you're interested in learning more about the HR compliance programs, we will post contact information at the conclusion of the webinar. So with that, I will turn it over to Chris.
Thank you, Randy. I appreciate that. And we appreciate everybody's time today. We know everybody's busy, and we appreciate you spending a little time with us to learn a little bit about HR. And, our hope today is that we're going to go through some of the just core fundamentals from an HR perspective, things that everybody should know and everybody should work toward. And we're going to go through why it's important, why it's important to your bottom line. We'll talk a little bit about hiring practices. We'll talk about troublesome employees. We'll talk about how to perform compliant terminations. And then also, what are some ways to tell if you are compliant? So again, hopefully, what we'll be able to do is express just some good core fundamentals that you can go back and take back into your business. So why is it important? And that's always the thing, right? Because HR, it's a lot of times people look at it, it's kind of defined by whoever's looking at it, if that makes sense. Everybody has a different take. And so if we look at some different things and the risk that's associated with this, as we look at EEO charges for the fiscal year 2018, sexual harassment lawsuits increased over 50% over 2017. Which makes sense because we have the Me Too movement. There's a lot more awareness. There's a lot more information out there, and those things seem to be coming to the forefront. Charges filed with the EEOC, so those that actually filed a charge with the EEOC are up 12%. So those are increasing as well. And then also, the EEOC recovered nearly $70 million for its victims of sexual harassment in 2018. Now that's compared to $47 million in 2017, so that's almost a 50% increase. So it's out there, the risk is out there, and it can really hurt businesses that are that have these lawsuits. Now, one thing too is we always hear, well, we don't have that problem. It doesn't happen to us. Our industry's different. Well, I did a 5-minute search for grocery and EEOC claims and came up with 3 examples in just a few minutes. If we look at one, there's an EEOC, they sued a grocery store for disability discrimination. Effectively what happened was someone needed to go out on medical leave and they were denied the medical leave. And they needed the leave because they had to have a surgery related to a disability. So that ran afoul of the Americans with Disabilities Act. So they were sued. Piggly Wiggly, they had a $50,000 fine that they had to pay for sexual harassment and retaliation. Effectively, what happened was a employee went to their management and told them about a harassment that was occurring, and they laughed, and they did nothing. And then eventually they sued them. They fired them. So they filed a suit with the EEOC, and they ended up having to pay $50,000. And then a third one, effectively a manager sexually harassed, groped 2 female employees. And then once they didn't comply, they ended up firing them. They cut their hours and then eventually just fired them. And when they did that, they got a $285,000 settlement out of that. So if we think about that, $50,000 settlement, almost a $300,000 settlement, there's expenses here that can really cost companies. And so that's really really important that we make sure that we note what those risks are. Also, when we look at Form I-9s, that's a hot topic today, right? A lot of we look at worksite investigations. You know, a lot of times what happens is people go, okay, so if it's a Democratic president, we know there's going to be laws that are coming. If it's a Republican president, oh, they love business, so we're not going to have all of the laws that we have to comply with. Well, in this scenario, what's the hot button? It's immigration. That's the big thing right now. And so from 2018 to 2017, the worksite investigations were up 255%. That's a huge number, and they're expected to increase even more next year. And so those are just going to continue to rise. Criminal arrests are up. Administrative work-related arrests are up. So it just continues to go up, and that's an area that's really hot right now, that's really going under a lot of spotlight. And the penalties for that, you can be looking up to over $2,100 per form. So, you know, we can do the math. If it's 50 employees, $2,100 per form, it adds up very quickly. So it's very important to get those I-9s and to get those compliant. And as we look at that, if we think about that also, you know what happened, you know, very recently, right? So there's a raid, immigration raid in Mississippi. They went in and they arrested nearly 700 people, and that was just from a few companies in a small area, and that was the largest single state raid in the history of the country. So they're really serious about the immigration and as far as making sure that employees that are eligible to work in the U.S. are working, and those that are not are not. Other examples of HR and how it can help you, it can decrease high employee turnover. If you're hiring entry-level employees, they can generally cost 30 to 50% of salary to replace. It's a big number. Health insurance, it's not properly removing employees from policy. That's a big number. Work opportunity tax credits. If you're not doing that and you're in the grocery industry, I would highly recommend you do that. That's something you can definitely talk to Randy and his group about. With that, you can get tax credits up to, it depends on the demographic, but you could get at them, I believe it's up to $9,000 tax credits for certain employees. So those are other ways that you can save money through human resource processes. So when we talk about hiring, what are those areas that are that we generally run across that are areas of concern? One is what we just talked about. It's ensuring employment eligibility. We want to make sure that when we hire an employee that they're eligible to work. If we don't, there's a big risk to the company. We want to make sure that we have a compliant hire packet, because what happens is if we don't, and it always ends up, right? There's a termination, there's a lawsuit, there's unemployment, there's something down the line that's going to happen. If we don't have all of our hire packets in a compliant fashion, it's going to come back to get us. And then also job descriptions. Job descriptions are very important. We'll talk about that. A lot of times they're overlooked. A lot of times people don't really consider those a vital part of the process, if you will, of staying compliant, but they're very important. So when we talk about I-9s, as you know, they are basically their forms that will prove if an employee is eligible to work in the U.S. That's what we're trying to do. If an employee has been hired after November 6, 1986, you have to have an I-9, okay? So that's very important. And we suggest that they're maintained in a separate file. If you're audited, you have to be able to produce those I-9s in 3 days. So our suggestion is always to keep those in a separate file, depending on your number of employees. What we see a lot of times is they're maintained in 3-ring binders, alphabetically, obviously, because it just makes them easy to get to. And that's very important, specifically if you're going through an audit. Also, some of the common mistakes that we see, a lot of times we're hiring people that are here and they may be on a work visa or whatever that may be, and those right, there's a termination date to those, right, or an expiration date. And so what the law says is that you have to go back and re-verify those, because what happens is if you have somebody that comes in on some type of limited work visa and it expires and you don't re-verify that, then they could be working at your company and not be eligible to work in the U.S. because maybe they don't renew their document, or it's not renewed by the government. And so that's a thing that we always see. So make sure if you do have those that are here on those temporary work visas or under some kind of temporary work status, to track those expiration dates so that you can go back and re-verify those at the time, around that time that they expire. That's very important. Also, one thing that we see a lot is the Section 1, it's filled out. Somebody comes in, they start work, 2 days later, we had to have them, it was an emergency. 2 days later, we give them their onboarding paperwork because we want to make sure that we can pay them. The pay week is the next week. Well, the problem is those I-9s, the Section 1 has to be filled out no later than the first day of employment. And so you want to make sure that regardless of what goes on that first day, that they fill that out. Now, obviously, if you can get that to them prior to that, then they can obviously fill that out prior to that. But that's a very important step. And then also, another thing that we see a lot specifically in the grocery industry, obviously you guys are you have multi-locations. There's a lot of groups that have 2, 3, 4, 5 and on number of stores. According to the law, whoever reviews those documents associated with I-9, the passport, the driver's license, social security number, the birth certificate, whatever those things may be, the employee has to be present with the person that's examining the documents. A lot of times what we see is those documents, they're just all scanned to the corporate office or the home office, and then they're the ones that fill everything out. But we need to make sure that whoever presents those documents, whoever the employee is, that they do physically present those to the document examiner so that they can make sure that the pictures match, et cetera. That's very important. Also, one thing we want to do is we want to make sure, our suggestion is that we shred the Form I-9s when you meet the time requirements, when you're allowed. The reason for that, the penalties that we spoke about for the Form I-9 are not just if you hire someone that's not eligible that you're going to be fined. The fines are also if you're filling out the forms incorrectly. And that's a very big thing, right? Because we want to we have to make sure that they're filled out correctly. And so there's a time limit. So essentially, you can shred an I-9 either 3 years from the date of hire or 1 year after termination, whichever one is later. So you can go in for those. Our suggestion is if you meet those requirements, shred them. Obviously, again, just to repeat that, it's 3 years from date of hire or 1 year from termination, whichever one is later. What that does is that just means if you ever are audited, we don't want you audited and penalized for forms that you really didn't even have to have on file. So that's important. If you'll go to the uscis.gov website and you'll search for Form M-274, there's a guide there that will show you how to fill out the Form I-9s. If you're hiring minors, I know a lot of you hire minors to be your courtesy clerks and those things. So it'll walk you through all those scenarios and exactly how to fill out an I-9. It's a great resource. Also, from an employee eligibility perspective, we look at the E-Verify. It's an internet-based program that's provided by the U.S. Essentially what it is an electronic I-9. That's kind of what it does. But even though it's a program from the federal government, its requirements are stateside. So some states require it, some states do not. I think about 22 states actually require E-Verify, and who has to do that in each state varies by state. So what I would suggest, look in your state, understand if you have those requirements or not, and to make sure that you are complying with those. Violations of those laws, depending on your state, can be pretty significant. Even they can, there's fines, there's penalties that can revoke your business license. So just make sure that you're staying in compliance with that. if you want to enroll in the E-Verify, I have the URL there at the bottom. You can go there and enroll in that process. It is a good program, and it works well. Also, when we talk about a hire pack, hire packs, they're, a lot of times we're throwing together W-4s and the state tax forms if they're applicable, and we probably have an I-9 in there and those things. But really, there's a lot more to it than that. We want to, just some examples, we want to make sure that we have their application. Obviously, the I-9 and the state tax forms. If you background check or drug test, we want to make sure that we have screening consent forms. We see a lot of people that don't do that. By law, if you are requiring background checks and you're using a third party, you have to get their authorization to do that. So we want to make sure that we have those consents. Handbook acknowledgement, that's really important, because what we want to make sure is down the road, when that lawsuit comes up, that unemployment claim pops up, whatever that may be, we want to make sure that we have that where they did state that they did receive the handbook and have read it. So that's very important. There's also other acknowledgments that you may have specific to your company, whether that's uniforms, whatever that may be. We want to make sure that's in there. Job descriptions, we want to make sure those are in there, because that way, again, if anything comes up in the future, we want to make sure that we have something on file where they signed that they received that job description and understood their duties. There are also, if there are other company-specific documents, and then also some states, California, for example, they have a lot of state documents that they require. So what you really want to do is look in your state and make sure what that is that needs to be included in that. So that's very important. Also, if you do work opportunity tax credits, if you are doing that today or do that in the future, you want to make sure that you have your YT questionnaires in there as well. So that's really important. We also want to make sure that we follow the federal and state document retention guidelines. Each one of these forms can be governed by different laws, and so they could have different retention guidelines. So what I would suggest, just make sure that you stay abreast of those and are aware of those guidelines to make sure that you're keeping those for the amount of time that you're required. And then also sexual harassment training. We suggest that whenever you hire new employees that you do a sexual harassment training. We think that's really important. And a lot of states are now requiring it. And so you actually have 6 today that are requiring it. You have California, which is starting in 2020, Connecticut, Delaware, Illinois, Maine, and New York. And even municipalities are getting in that. So New York City requires sexual harassment training. So if you're required, make sure that you're meeting the specifications for your state, because all of them are a little different. If you're not required, I still suggest that you perform the sexual harassment training, because what we want to do is, one, obviously we don't want sexual harassment in our workplace. If it does occur, what we want to be able to show as employers is that we have policies against it in our handbook. We have trained that it's not acceptable. And so what we're able to do is kind of separate the company from the actions of that employee that's performed the harassment. And so that's very important. You want to make sure you keep all that on file as well, in that employee's file. Job descriptions, again, those are very important. A lot of people don't use those, but we always suggest that you do. One, in some of the benefits, it increases quality of new hires. What it does there is it makes you sit down and define the position and really think through what you need in that position, what those characteristics are. So when you're interviewing, it really puts that in the forefront. And so I'll give you an example. I'm looking for someone today, and the first thing that we did, or that I did, when I decided to hire this position, is create a job description, because I wanted to really think through what does that position require, and what are the characteristics that I'm going to need to make that a successful hire. And so that it's really good for that. Also, we use them all the time for unemployment cases, lawsuits, to show where we demonstrated or explained to them what those duties were. It justifies overtime exemptions, because it really lays out what their duties are. And then also it can justify Affordable Care Act classifications, like full-time, variable hour, seasonal, all those different things as well. So they're very important in that management process. And good job descriptions, we want to make sure that we have Fair Labor Standards Act. Are they exempt, non-exempt? We want to make sure we state, are they full-time, part-time, variable? What are the skills and abilities that we have to have? For instance, if you're going to hire an accountant, how are they at reconciliations? Those kind of things. We also want to look at competencies. Competency, where skills and abilities are more, what they are able to do. Competencies are more, are they punctual? Are they very tedious in what they do? Those kind of attributes that a candidate may have. Also, what we want, obviously we want to list their duties, physical attributes. So do they have to lift 30 pounds? Do they stand all day? Those kind of things. And that's very important, because if somebody walks in, you cannot say, hey, I saw you have a limp. What's wrong with you? How's your back? Does your back hurt? You can't ask those questions. And so, but what we can say is, hey, these are the physical attributes that we require for this job. You're going to be stocking shelves. You're going to have to lift. You're going to have to stand. You're going to have to bend. Can you perform these physical attributes? If they say yes, and a week in it's pretty obvious that they can't, we can use that as part of that termination process. So it's very important. And then also work environment. Are they going to be in a hot warehouse, whatever that may be? So those are very, very important to make sure that those job descriptions, they can help you. Again, they can help you from the beginning when you're hiring all the way to the end if there's a issue that pops up, after the termination. So when we start talking about also troublesome employees, we start talking about terminations and those things. Here's the thing, and for us, one of the things that we see in this industry is a lot of times training of management is lacking. And, usually managers are promoted because they're very good at their job. They may not be promoted because they're the best people managers, right? And what we also find is a lot of times in this industry is a lot of times those managers are really trained really well on what they do, right? You have all kind of safety training, OSHA training, you have all these different things, but we may not have the workforce management training. And that's so important, because what we want those managers to do is we want to train them on how to manage, how to coach their employees, right? Because that helps with engagement. It helps with just making sure you have a good culture. But also what we want to do is train them on the regulatory side. Not that they have to be experts, not that they have to know everything about FMLA. What we do want them to know is just enough to know when they need to call somebody for help, right? So we need to make sure that they at least kind of understand FMLA, and if they have somebody going out on pregnancy or surgery or whatever that may be, that they know enough to call the HR department and to say, hey, somebody's going out on maternity, what should we do? So we think that's really important, and it gets you out of a lot of trouble. And I'll give you an example with that. One of the things we always, the clients we work with, we always want their managers to call us before a termination so that we can look at it and see what's going on. Well, we had a manager call us, and I use this example a lot, and he wanted to terminate an employee because they weren't coming to work and they were out all the time. And okay, well, based on your policies, based on the number of absences, all those kind of things, you can certainly terminate them. Well, the issue, and then we asked the question, well, why are they not at work? Well, it was because they had not, they were taking care of their wife who was ill. That's a whole nother story, because now you've got Family Medical Leave Act involved. And not only can you not terminate them, there are certain protections that employee has that we have to make sure that we notify them about. So if there was more training for that supervisor, they would have known that, at least to be able to say, hey, something's going on, let's talk about this. But that's one reason we like for people to call us, so we can fish those things out before any termination occurs. Also, one thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we have a training program on managing the employees, as I said. so that they learn how to coach, they learn how to help employees to grow, because that's really important, because at someday, right, everybody retires, everybody leaves. And so if we can build that culture of training and teaching and those things, when that happens, we should have somebody trained that can take their place. And then also, as far as that training goes, there are a lot of options there. There are webinars, there's online training, there's in-person training. There's a lot of different ways to do that. And a lot of them are very economical. And so that's one thing that I would suggest to think about, is to definitely go through and, think about that training and how to make sure employees, again, your managers, again, they don't have to be experts. They just need to know when to call somebody. So we think that's very important. Now, one thing about complaints, as we have issues with employees, and we all get complaints, right? One thing we hear a lot is, well, look, I'm going to tell you this, but I don't want you to do anything. I just want you to know. Well, you can't do that, right? If somebody tells you something, then you've got to address it. It can't be, I'm going to tell you, but don't do anything, because what's going to happen if that thing blows up, regardless of what they say, they're going to say they told you. So anytime someone tells you something, we need to make sure that we investigate it. So we want to make sure that we give credence to all complaints. We hear a lot, managers say, there's nothing to that. We don't need to do anything with that. We need to investigate everything. That's very important. And that's one of the things that we talked about earlier. Piggly Wiggly paid $50,000 because they wouldn't investigate a claim, because the manager laughed at them and just didn't think it was serious. So it can come back and get you. What we want to do is we want to make sure, as we're investigating these, we want to make sure that we give employees options for reporting that, right? Have it in your handbook. It's an open door policy. They can go to the owner. They can tell the supervisor. Tip lines are a great way for that as well, because those tip lines, they can do that anonymously, and a lot of times they may not report it because maybe it's their supervisor that's doing it. And the tip lines are a great way that they can report that without fear of retaliation. We want to make sure that we document everything. Don't document it later. We run into a lot of cases where we're trying to help somebody and they didn't document anything, and so right before the lawsuit, we have to turn all the documents in. They come back and they're trying to write everything up. Make sure you document as you go. We want to make sure that after we do that, after we hold our investigation, we write a report. We go through that. We want to make sure, it may be, depending on how serious it is, you may want to get a lawyer to review that as well. You want to make sure that if there are questions or holes in that, after you do that initial report, do that follow-up and have those follow-up conversations, and then decide a course of action and go through with that and keep that confidential. A lot of times whoever the complainant will come back and say, well, I want to know exactly what happened to them. What did you do to them? You don't have to tell them that. You can just say that we addressed it. We talked to the employee. We had a disciplinary around that. And that's really all they need to know. You don't have to tell them everything that happened. And we see a lot of times where these cases go, and then all of a sudden you have a manager or somebody like that goes off in during the investigation, and they're telling everybody in the store. And we've had that happen, and they end up ostracizing the person that made the complaint. So we want to make sure that we keep that confidential and that everybody knows that. So what do we do? So we've done this investigation. We've looked at the complaint. What do we do now? Well, we want to make sure that whatever we do, we're consistent. Look, here's the thing. We all like people differently, right? I'm sure you work with people that you would love to go out and have lunch with. I'm sure you work with people that you would rather eat by yourself. But it's very important that as we're having this in this disciplinary process, that we're very consistent, whether we like them or not, that we're very consistent. We want to make sure that we review policies and performance infractions and the consequences. Again, if this has happened before, we need to have the same punishment unless there's some kind of variable there. And then also what we can do is we can move towards progressive counseling. So essentially what we'll do is we put them on a plan where they have to meet certain benchmarks. And, if they're not improving, that we can grow that, and have more, or if they have continued violations, have stiffer penalties as we go. We can always move straight to termination as well. That's always an option. We want to make sure, again, just like I said before, document. We want to make sure we document everything, even verbal warnings. I hear a lot of times where we say, well, do you have documentation? No, it was verbal. The verbal is how you communicate that to the employee. It's not that you don't have to write that up and put it in your file. So even if it's a verbal, make sure that you document that, and make sure that you put your action that's taken, and then make sure you specify, if there are other occurrences, what are we going to do about it? What are those further actions? So it's very important. And again, what we can do is there's several courses of action that we can go. We can do disciplinary. We can do training. Again, it may be, we talked about manager training. Obviously, there's employee training, so we can go back and train them on those situations. It may be we reassign duties. I know, I'll give you an example. In a company I used to work for, there was a harassment claim, and we had a bunch of stores. We were very similar to you guys. We were retail. We had a bunch of stores spread out, and there was a office manager that had a sexual harassment claim against a manager. And the first thing we did was we moved them. Obviously, we separated them and investigated it because we didn't want them working together, obviously, while this was going forward. And at some point, we found out that it really wasn't the manager that was harassing. It was really more of a mutual until the husband found out. It's one of those deals. And so from that, we didn't terminate. We didn't do those things. What we did was we just reassigned their duties. We just wouldn't let them work together anymore. We pulled them apart and put them in different stores. And so, we can do things like that. We can do periodic reviews, performance management. And again, even though we have a progressive disciplinary policy in our handbook, we can always move straight to termination. I get that question a lot. We have 3 steps. Well, you have 3 steps, but if they just stole 5 cases of steaks and harassed somebody on their way out the back door, you can terminate them. You don't have to go through those 3 steps. We do want that outlined in our policy, though. So that's very important. And then terminations, as we go through terminations, that's all, again, one thing that we always suggest is, unless it is just a simple cut and dried termination, review it with somebody, regardless of what it is. We want to make sure that we're consistent. Again, we want to make sure if we terminated somebody for one thing and it's the same situation, that we terminate the next, because that's very important. Because what they're going to do is, as you know, everybody in the stores know exactly what's happened. And so if they know that someone else was not terminated for doing that, and now you're terminating them, unless you can differentiate those situations, there's going to be an issue because there's not that consistency. So when you decide to terminate, we've kind of gotten to that point. We've gone through the progressive discipline. It's just that time. What I would suggest is make sure, again, review the situation to determine the risk. And there's always risk with terminations. Again, everybody can sue everybody for everything. Doesn't mean it's right, doesn't mean they're going to win, but everybody can be sued. So you want to make sure that you understand all the risks associated with it. And then go through their file. All those, when we talked about that hire packet and we talked about, handbook acknowledgments and those things, make sure that information's in there. Make sure those write-ups are in there. A lot of times we'll be involved in a termination, and we go and the first thing that we'll do is we'll say, okay, well, send us their file, because this employee, from what we've been told, is just a horrendous employee. So there has to be a ton of write-ups. And the only thing we see are performance reviews that are giving them 4 stars. We want to make sure before we terminate anybody to make sure that if there has been disciplinary, again, we need to document, we need to have that in their file. We would like to have that at the time it occurred, But if it has not, when we're doing this personnel file, we want to go ahead and get those documents in the file. If you look at it and you think it's going to be really kind of a sticky situation, maybe because of their demographic, whatever that may be, it may make sense to get a labor attorney to review that. Okay, to just look at those ramifications, to get them in on the front end. We also see a lot of times where we know this is a bait job, where an employee is baiting an employer to fire them. That happens a lot. And so when we see that, again, it's always good to get an attorney in those situations on the front end so that they can be aware of it, kind of guide it from the beginning versus coming in after a lawsuit's filed. So that's always good. Now, when we do the termination, we want to make sure that it's private. You know, I can remember back when I was started working, you know, they'd go out in the warehouse and yell at somebody and fire them in the warehouse in front of everybody. We really don't need to do that. We need to do it in a private setting. I would make sure that a HR or supervisor level members there with the termination, regardless of what it's for, as a witness. Also, what I like to do as well, as a male, if I'm firing a female, I want another female in the room. I don't want that employee to ever be able to come back and say, well, he asked for something, I said no, and he fired me, or whatever that may be. So if you're a male terminating a female, I would always have another female in the room, and vice versa. If you're a female firing a male, I would always have that. Because as we talk about harassment and those things, that's not just men to women. We fought where men have claimed sexual harassment. And then also we've claimed we're men against men and women against women. So that's not a one-way street. So make sure that you have somebody of the opposite sex in there. You know, go through their final pay, make sure they understand how that's going to be handled. Keep it very simple and brief. You don't have to tell them everything about everything. What I have always been told, and as I kind of grew through my management track, is keep it simple, keep it brief, say what you got to say, and get them out. Because anytime the more you say, the more they can use if it does go to unemployment, lawsuits, and those things. So keep it very brief. And then think about security. If this person's kind of a hothead, or you think there may be an issue, depending on that situation, you may want to have somebody at the door. We have had terminations that have occurred where we've had the police send an officer to either sit in the store or sit in the parking lot, whatever that may be, if we think there's a risk. Because obviously if there's an officer there, they're less likely to cause a scene or to have a physical confrontation. So think through those things before you do that termination as well. Those are very important. And then also, so we've talked about a lot of different things. And so from an audit perspective, you know, to make sure that you're compliant, you know, it's a good thing to always kind of go back through the way you do things and to do an audit. And that sounds real serious and that sounds real time consuming, but it may be something where every quarter you just kind of pick an area and you just kind of review it. But you want to look at your Affordable Care Act. That's real big. Most of you guys probably 50 or more, I would guess. And so when you do that, look to make sure that you're complying with the measurement period calculations. If you are close to 50 or you just reached 50, you want to make sure, you know, maybe are you an applicable large employer? You want to look at that. So just kind of, it just gives you a chance to sit down and focus and go through that. Go through your hiring and separation procedures. We talked about I-9 and E-Verify. Get that manual I showed you earlier. Get that manual, go through those I-9s and make sure that you're filling them out correctly. If those are done remotely in your stores, you may want to grab a sample. Grab 10 from each store, 5 from each store, whatever that is, and review them and make sure that they're filled out correctly. They have the right dates, those kind of things. Have your handbook reviewed. We suggest annually because times change, and it's not just, obviously regulations change, and you want to make sure that you have the regulations in there, but also times change, business changes. You know, we didn't have to worry about a social media policy 5 to 10 years ago. So just to make sure that you're kind of keeping up with the times and the different policies that you need. Recruitment, hiring practices, workplace rules, supervisor and employee training, just go through those and make sure. It's just a way, again, we're all busy and it's so easy to get caught up in just our everyday work, right? How we're doing things, because we got employees that are yelling at us. We've got work that's got to be done. We've got deadlines for things. It's easy just to keep going as we're going. And what this does is it just gives us that ability to step back for a minute and just kind of objectively look at these areas and just see where we are and make sure we're compliant, that we're doing it the best way possible.